The streets of Meridia had begun to stir, but their usual hum of life was muted in the Bard's district. Vash, Gideon and Taran moved with purpose, their footsteps quick against the slick cobblestone still damp with morning dew. The alleys around them felt unnaturally quiet, as though the city itself held its breath. Taran walked ahead, his shoulders hunched against the chill breeze that drifted through the narrow lanes. "Thanks for coming with me," he muttered over his shoulder, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "No problem," Vash replied lightly, though his sharp eyes flicked toward the shadows clinging to the walls like silent spectators. "But remind me again why we're risking our necks in Bard territory." "Because I needed backup," Taran muttered, barely sparing him a glance, "and because Silas was in no shape to leave the house." Gideon exhaled sharply. "Not his best week." His tone was dry, but concern lurked beneath it, like an undertow beneath calm waters. Mira's just about ready to lash him to the bedposts if it'll keep him from staggering around like a drunken deckhand. Taran shook his head, his expression darkening. She might have to. The poor fool's burning up worse than a ship caught in a corsair's lantern fire. His voice lowered, as if speaking the words aloud made them worse. Mira's tried everything. Cold rags soaked in sea breeze oil, even brewed up an infusion of spire bloom steeped so strong it should have frozen his blood. Nothing touches it. Vash frowned, his hand brushing instinctively against the hilt of his dagger as they passed a particularly dark alley. "Spire bloom?" He shot Taran a sharp look. "That stuff could cool the gates of Solace itself. If that's not working, then it's not the fever we should be worried about." Taran's voice was grim, his fingers twitching at his side. "Either it's too far gone, or his body is fighting something we can't see." Gideon's brow furrowed, his steps slowing just a fraction. Something's off. His voice, usually a steady anchor, wavered like a rope fraying under strain. "He's been worse ever since we came back with this haul." A quiet beat passed between them. Taran let out a humorless chuckle, though it sat heavy in his chest. "Mira's not wrong to worry. You know how stubborn Silas gets. If he had his way, he'd be on his feet right now, swearing to every god listening that he was fine, even as the sweat poured off him and his hands shook like a green sailor in his first storm." Vash smirked, though his hand brushed the hilt of his dagger. "And here we are, playing bodyguard. Not that I'm complaining, but you've been quiet about why you don't come around here much yourself." "Because I avoid it when I can," Taran admitted, lowering his voice as they rounded a corner. The buildings seemed to press closer here, their looming shapes crowding out the pale light of dawn. The bards don't like strangers poking around, especially when those strangers have something worth stealing. They've got eyes everywhere. One wrong move, and they'll make sure you regret it. Gideon frowned, his broad frame cutting an imposing silhouette as he scanned their surroundings. Then why trust Lenka? Taran hesitated, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "She's fair enough. For the right price anyway, but she's no saint. If something about this deal smells wrong, we leave. Agreed?" "Agreed," Gideon said, though his jaw tightened. Vash opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden rustling above made all three of them freeze. The sound came again, softer this time, like the scrape of a boot against stone. Vash's hand was already on his dagger, Gideon shifting slightly to shield Taran behind his bulk. "Don't move," came a voice from above, low and commanding. Gideon's eyes snapped upward to see a figure crouched on the ledge of a crumbling building. The morning light caught on the gleam of a blade in her hand. Her silhouette was sharp, her cloak shifting slightly in the breeze. "Althea," Vash muttered under his breath, his voice tight. The girl leapt down with feline grace, landing lightly a few feet in front of them, Her blade caught the light for a moment before she sheathed it. Her dusky rose hair, streaked with auburn, framed a face that was both calculating and amused. "Did I scare you?" she asked, her lips curling into a smirk. Vash relaxed slightly, though his hand didn't leave his weapon. "Scare us? Number surprise us?" "Maybe. Nice trick." Althea's eyes flicked to him and her smirk widened. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Why are you here?" Taran asked, his tone wary. Her smile faltered, her gaze darting briefly to the rooftops. "Because I don't feel like being found. My uncle's men are looking for me, and I'd rather not make it easy for them." "Your uncle?" Gideon asked, his brow furrowing. "Let's just say family dinners are complicated," Althea said, waving a hand dismissively. "I heard you were heading to the Black Note. Figured I'd tag along. Safety in numbers, right?" Taran hesitated, but Vash grinned. "If you can keep up, I don't see why not." Althea's eyes sparkled as she stepped closer. "Oh, I can keep up." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The real question is, can you—" "Try me," Vash shot back, his grin widening. "Enough," Taran said sharply, though there was no real heat in his tone. "Let's just get to Lenka before we attract any more attention." The Black Note sat at the end of a crooked alley, a forgotten relic of the Bard's district. Its facade was unassuming, weathered wood marred by faint carvings that might once have been elegant. A faded black musical note adorned the door, barely visible against the grime that coated it. "This is it?" Vash asked, raising an eyebrow as he scanned the dilapidated structure. "This is it," Taran confirmed, stepping forward. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the air inside hit them like a wall. It was thick with the scent of incense and damp wood, tinged with something metallic and faintly sour. The dim light of a few hanging lanterns illuminated shelves, sagging under the weight of strange objects, jars filled with murky liquids, rusted tools with unrecognizable purposes, and fabrics that shimmered unnaturally. A woman emerged from the shadows behind the counter, her sharp green eyes scanning them with interest. Wiry and deliberate in her movements, Lenka was a figure that demanded attention. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and her thin smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Taran," she said, her voice low and even. "Bringing new faces into my shop, are we?" "They're my partners," Taran said quickly, setting the satchel on the counter. "We've got something you might like." Lenka raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking to Vash and Gideon, lingering briefly on Althea before returning to Taran. "Interesting company you keep." "You'd be surprised," Taran muttered. Lenka opened the satchel and began pulling out its contents, the jagged dagger, the ornate goblets, and the intricately carved idol. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she examined each piece, her fingers lingering on the dagger's runes. "Corsairs," she murmured, her tone tinged with both awe and disgust. "Corsairs?" Gideon asked, stepping closer, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Lenka set the dagger down carefully as though it might bite. "You've heard of them, haven't you?" "Stories," Vash said lightly, but there was an edge to his tone, too sharp to be casual. "Monsters of the sea, cursed sailors." Lenka's sharp green eyes flicked to him, her gaze scrutinizing. "Stories," she repeated, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smirk. "That's a lie if I've ever heard one." Vash stiffened but held her gaze. "Think what you want, old lady. Doesn't change the fact we brought you something worth buying." Lenka leaned forward, her expression darkening as her fingers brushed the hilt of the dagger. "No need to play coy with me, Dockling. You've seen them, haven't you?" Gideon's hand twitched at his side, but Vash said nothing, his silence confirmation enough. Lenka sat back, her voice lowering as though the walls themselves might betray them. They were men once, sailors who ventured into forbidden waters, places no map dares to chart. The promise of treasure lured them to their doom, but they didn't die. They were twisted, cursed by the corruption they sought to claim, and everything they touched. She gestured to the items on the counter. Everything they touched carries that corruption, whispers of the serpent. It spreads, slowly, quietly, but it spreads. She exhaled, her fingers trailing over the dagger's hilt, almost as if she could feel something writhing beneath the metal. "There are whispers in the deep," she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. "A hunger older than the tides, slithering beneath the surface, waiting for those foolish enough to listen. Not all gods give freely like your sweet muse of the waves." Her sharp green eyes flicked to them, a knowing glint buried in the depths. "Some only take. Some offer gifts that rot the hands that hold them. And once you've heard the serpent's whisper, it never really leaves you." Vash frowned, his jaw tightening. "You're saying this taint, or whatever it is in everything they've touched?" Lenka nodded grimly. "The Corsairs didn't just sail into cursed waters. They brought those waters back with them. The veil they crossed, it clings to them, infects the very air around them. Now it's here, and judging by the company you've been keeping," she tapped the dagger pointedly, "it's closer than you'd like to think." "Why buy it then?" Gideon asked, his tone tense. Lenka chuckled, low and humorless. "Because there's always someone willing to pay for power, even if it comes at a price. And because I'm not stupid enough to keep it," she straightened. 300 crowns for the lot." 4, Taran countered. Lenka smirked. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when the coin brings trouble." She counted out the money with sharp, deliberate movements. As they gathered their coins, Althea wandered toward a shelf stacked with strange trinkets. "What about this?" she asked, holding up a small pendant shaped like a coiled serpent. Lenka's eyes flicked to the pendant, her expression darkening. "That's not for sale." "Why not?" Althea pressed, her tone teasing. "Because some things are better left where they belong," Lenka said sharply, "and that doesn't belong to you." Althea raised an eyebrow but set the pendant back without argument. The group left the black note quickly, retracing their steps through the narrow alleys. The Bard's district was slowly waking, its silence broken by distant voices and the occasional bark of a merchant opening their stall. But there was no time to linger. Unease prickled at their skin like a second shadow. "Lenka's charming," Vash muttered, his voice low enough that only Gideon heard. "Charming enough to make me want to leave," Gideon replied, his eyes scanning the rooftops as they walked. "But at least she's got the hall now. If that loot had anything to do with Silas—" He trailed off, his tone uneasy. Vash shot him a glance, his sharp features shadowed in the dim light of the alley. "You think it was the treasure? The corruption she was going on about?" "Wouldn't be the first time cursed junk caused trouble," Gideon muttered, his hand tightening on his sword's hilt. Taran, walking a few paces ahead, finally broke his silence. "Let's hope you're right. If that was the cause, Silas should start improving now that it's out of our hands. Mira's running out of ideas." His tone was tense, the usual calm authority replaced by a thread of uncertainty. "Yeah, well, if he doesn't get better soon, that means the treasure wasn't the problem," Vash muttered grimly. "And then we've got bigger issues." Althea, trailing behind them, let out a low hum, her dusky rose hair catching the faint light as she glanced over her shoulder. "If Silas doesn't get better," she said, her voice sharp but thoughtful, "then the loot wasn't the only thing touched by that corruption. You might want to think long and hard about where else it might have spread." The group fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like the damp mist clinging to the cobblestones. Taran quickened his pace, his jaw set. Althea lingered for a moment, her gaze sweeping the shadows with a practiced ease, before following the group toward the safer streets ahead. They were nearing the edge of the district when Gideon froze. A column of green smoke coiled into the sky like a serpent, twisting above the rooftops, its color vivid against the pale blue of the morning. Taran stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he just stared. Then his face went pale, his expression crumbling from wary determination to something closer to raw panic. "No, no, no, no!" His voice broke as he whirled on them, wild-eyed. "That's the Forsaken. That's the recall." Vash frowned, still catching his breath. "The what?" "It means the house is under attack," Taran shouted, his voice cracking. "It's a call to every scavenger in the city. Drop everything and run. Get back, now." The words barely left his mouth before he took off, bolting down the street with a desperation none of them had ever seen from him before. Gideon didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, muscles coiling as he tore after him. Vash cursed and followed, the urgency contagious. Althea hesitated. Her gaze flicked between the column of green smoke and the path ahead, her fingers twitching at her belt. Then she muttered something under her breath, her expression darkening, and sprinted after them. The city blurred around them as they ran, the acrid green smoke rising higher with every step.